The old town square of Willow Creek didn't much change, which was why folks felt safe, even if they were always a little damp. It was built around a single massive oak tree, a silent, mossy giant that had seen a century of Sundays come and go, and beneath it stood a cast-iron bench. This was the place where Silas spent his life now, though he didn't call it a life, not anymore. He called it a station. He was 30 years old, and he knew more about the patterns of the clouds than any farmer in the county. He knew the difference between a weak mist that barely wet the pavement and the deep, soul-cleansing downpour that tasted of honest grief. Silas waited for the rain, not just to feel it, but because of a promise whispered to him 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days ago. The girl, Lila, she had been a flash of fire. His mother, Ma, a woman whose love was quiet but vast as the Mississippi, would bring him soup. She never pleaded or argued. She just understood the particular kind of quiet madness that could take root in a young man's heart. She'd set the tin pot on the bench next to him, kiss his wet hair and say, "Silas, eat now. The watching takes strength." She knew the promise, too. She had seen the way Lila looked at him, like he was the last drop of cool water on a scorching day. Ma's silence was his only true sanctuary, for it validated his vigil without requiring a single explanation. One night, a fierce lightning storm ripped through the square. The rain came down so hard it was like the sky had shattered, and the water was thick and muddy, surging over the curbs. Silas stayed, soaked to the bone, laughing into the wind. This had to be it. This was the rain big enough, dramatic enough, to justify Lila's return. He saw figures moving in the storm's blur, the shadows of trees, the flapping awning of Homer's store, and every one of them momentarily transformed into the silhouette of Lila. He strained his eyes until they ached, until the sight of the world was just a painful white blur. But the storm passed, leaving behind a pristine, star-shot sky, and the bench remained empty, just Silas and the residual smell of ozone and wet earth. He realized then that the quality of the rain mattered, not just its quantity. It had to be the right kind of rain. The second year brought the cruelest test, a drought. For 8 long months, the sky was a perfect, unrelenting cobalt blue. The sun bleached the sidewalks, cracked the clay soil, and made the leaves of the old oak curl up like burnt parchment. The waiting became a silent, internal scream. It was easy to wait in the rain when the condition was being met, but how do you wait for a condition that seems actively impossible? During this time, Silas found himself pacing the perimeter of the square, walking concentric circles around the bench, his shoes kicking up fine, yellowish dust. He started seeing Lila everywhere in the dry, sun-baked world. Her hair in the shimmering heat haze above the asphalt, her white dress reflected in the polished glass of Homer's storefront, her laugh carried on the dry, rattling wind. The subconscious, that deep well Lila had touched, began to play tricks on him. He started talking to the bench, whispering his doubts and fears into the cold iron. "She meant it," he'd murmur, defending her to the inanimate object. "She meant, when it rains again, not if it rains again." She knew it would come. This period was vital because it shifted the focus from the external event, the rain, to the internal state, the faith. The entire town had given up on the rain, and on Silas. One parched afternoon, Homer walked out with 2 iced teas and sat heavily on the bench next to Silas, deliberately ignoring the dust. "She told me something that Lila," Homer confessed, looking out at the wilting petunias. Silas went rigid, his breath catching painfully in his throat. This was new. This was a clue. Said she wasn't from here. Said she was passing through on a journey, a kind of test. And she said the test was finding someone who understood the difference between waiting and knowing. Homer took a slow sip, the ice clinking loudly in the silence. She said, "The thing you're looking for ain't always what you're looking at, Homer." Silas stared at the old man. "What does that mean, Homer?" "I don't know, son. Just passing it along." Homer's words opened a new, terrifying layer of suspense. Was Lila's promise merely a filter? Was the rain itself a metaphor? Did "when it rains again" mean when Silas's spirit was washed clean again? He looked at the cracked clay and the relentlessly blue sky. His internal drought suddenly felt far more profound than the external one. He had been waiting for water, but perhaps he should have been waiting for wisdom. The bench felt less like a station and more like a crucible. The town had a festival celebrating the eventual return of water, called the Hope for Rain Jamboree, and Silas refused to attend. He saw the irony. Celebrating what he lived for, yet unable to join the celebration because the condition had not been met. He had to be separate, pure in his purpose. But that night, as the jamboree band played faint, cheerful music across the square, the air shifted. A single, distinct scent of damp earth and ozone, a scent so familiar it felt like a shock to his own nervous system, drifted over the noise. Silas stood up, a jolt running through his long, weary body. He looked up at the moonless sky. It was still dark, still clear, but the scent was undeniable. It was the precursor, the promise before the promise. He gripped the edge of the bench, feeling the cold metal press into his palm. He walked toward the oak tree, ran his hand over its rough, barnacled bark, and leaned his head against the trunk. The tree seemed to pulse with a low, deep thrumming, the sound of roots drinking deep from a hidden, subterranean reservoir. He understood something then about Willow Creek, about the South itself. The water was always there, hidden, deep, and patient. The question was not if it would rain, but when the hidden water chose. The long dry spell finally broke with a sudden, vicious thunderclap that sounded less like weather and more like the cracking of a colossal whip. The first few drops were fat and splattering, hitting the dust and turning it immediately into slick, dark mud. Silas was on the bench immediately. The rain came down, not gentle but brutal, washing the square of all its dust and the accumulated disbelief of the town. He was soaked instantly, his clothes clinging to him like a second skin. He watched the paths, expecting, demanding, that Lila appear now. This was the rain. This was the moment. But the paths remained empty, just streaks of black water and whipping tree branches. After an hour, the heavy rain softened into a steady, persistent drizzle. The kind of rain that settles in for days, the very definition of when it rains again. Still nothing. A profound fatigue settled over Silas, heavier than the waterlogged blanket he pulled out of his bag. He had passed the test of faith during the drought, only to fail the test of patience during the deluge. He had made the rain too dramatic, too cinematic in his mind. Lila was not a goddess of the storm. She was a girl who made a simple promise. His overdramatization had perhaps obscured the simple truth. He closed his eyes and tried to remember her face without the filter of 2 years of longing. Just the plain, honest features of the day she left. He started reading again, books he had abandoned years ago. He needed to re-engage with the world, even if he couldn't leave the square. He read about time and space, about physics and philosophy, always under the shelter of the old oak. He found a passage in an old book about causality that struck him like a stone. The act of waiting creates the condition of the return. This twisted his mind in a beautiful, agonizing knot. Was he waiting for Lila, or was Lila waiting for his perfect waiting? Had his impatience during the initial storms prevented her from appearing? He realized he had been watching the exterior world, the sky, the paths, the clock, when he should have been cultivating the interior world. The waiting was the work. The promise was the reward. The rain was just the stage. He started keeping a journal not about Lila, but about the rain. He documented its sound, its smell, the way it affected the light beneath the oak, turning the air green, then gray, then blue-black. He was now a serious meteorologist of the heart, recording the precise emotional barometer of every passing shower. He needed to understand the mechanics of the stage to truly understand the nature of the performance. The suspense was no longer about if she would come, but about when he would finally. The winter arrived, cold and bitter, the rain turning frequently to sleet and then snow, the first snow in 3 years. Silas stayed. The bench became rimmed with ice, and the old oak stood stark and black against the white landscape. Ma brought him heavy wool blankets and thick coffee, her eyes full of silent, worried questions. He thought about leaving, just for a night, to feel the warmth of a real bed, but the thought was immediately rejected by the core of his being. The promise was about the rain, yes, but it was also about the bench. The physical presence, the unyielding commitment to the location, was part of the spell. If he abandoned the bench, even for comfort, he was saying that comfort mattered more than the promise, and he knew Lila, the elusive firefly Lila, valued devotion above all things. He scraped the ice off the iron with his gloved hands, feeling the bone-deep cold. He was testing the limits of his own subconscious commitment. How much would he sacrifice? His comfort, his job, his reputation, all gone. All that remained was the raw, essential, waiting Silas, purified by cold and isolation. The snow was a different kind of rain, frozen stillness, a pause in the saga. The spring thaw brought the most beautiful rain he had ever known. It wasn't violent. It was gentle, warm, and cleansing, smelling of pine needles and newly turned earth. It was the color of possibility. On one of these perfect rainy mornings, Homer, leaning out of his shop door, didn't shake his head or offer pity. He just called out, "Silas, you've become a fixture, son. Like the oak itself. People stop their cars to see if you're there when it rains. You're a landmark." Silas felt a strange surge of pride. He had become part of the town's geography, part of its folklore. The waiting had transcended the personal and become communal. He was no longer just the boy waiting for a girl. He was the embodiment of Willow Creek's own stubborn hope, its refusal to let go of the impossible dream. This was the true nature of the Southern folktale. The rhythm of repetition, the slow, agonizing, beautiful grinding of the personal into the eternal. The bench held its breath, just as it had 3 years prior, and Silas felt the familiar, addictive tension. The rain was the mystery of Lila had grown into a local legend. Children dared each other to touch the bench when it wasn't raining, believing it held some residual magic. One day, a young history student from the state university came to interview Silas. He carried a small recorder and a notebook, treating Silas like an artifact of local culture. "Sir," the student asked earnestly, "do you believe the girl, Lila, represents something else? The town's lost innocence, perhaps? Or the promise of prosperity that never arrived?" Silas smiled, a slow, rust-eaten smile. "She represents Lila," he said simply, "and her word." But the student's question had merit. The story had taken on a life of its own, accessed by the subconscious needs of the community. They projected their own longings onto Lila's return. This forced Silas to look at the rain again, not as a physical event, but as a cultural signifier. When it rains again could mean when Willow Creek remembers who it truly is. The weight of this collective longing was a heavy mantle, making his solitary wait suddenly feel like a vital, community-sustaining ritual. He could not leave, not now. He owed it to the town's history, as much as he owed it to Lila's promise. He spent the next few months researching the bench itself. The old cast iron was engraved with nearly invisible script beneath the flaking green paint. He spent days tracing the letters with his finger until he could make out the inscription. "A promise made must be redeemed here, where the water flows." He never mentioned this discovery to anyone, not even Ma. The water flows, Willow Creek. The promise was inextricably linked to the place. This wasn't a random meeting spot. It was a designated altar of devotion. The new conflict was theological, almost. What constituted redemption in this context? He thought of the town's river, the sluggish, muddy Willow, which often dried up completely in the summer. Did "where the water flows" refer to the river, or the deep, powerful aquifer beneath the square? He had focused on the sky, when the answer might be in the earth. He began to listen not just to the falling rain, but to the silence underneath it, the faint, persistent murmur of the groundwater. He had a sudden, terrifying vision. What if the rain had to be so heavy that the river actually overflowed, washing over the square, before Lila would appear? The spring transitioned into a wet summer, a beautiful time of daily, rhythmic showers that kept the moss lush and the air thick with the smell of petrichor. Silas was a picture of serene anticipation. He had achieved a state of almost monk-like presence. He sat, calm, dry under the oak's wide canopy, observing the rain as an external, inevitable phenomenon. He had shed his impatience. He had shed his self-pity. He was simply existing at the station. This period of peace and acceptance, however, was also the most suspenseful. The rain was too perfect. The waiting was too easy. The rhythmic repetition of the gentle rain felt like the model of a trap. Lila was never one for easy answers. If she was a riddle, the answer wouldn't be found in the gentle, predictable summer showers. The suspense was born of the very harmony of the weather. He knew with a sinking certainty that the true, final test would not be the absence of rain, but a rain so unnatural, so devastating, that it would require him to choose between staying and survival. He packed his bag with a heavy rope and a small emergency kit, preparing for the kind of biblical rain that could turn Willow Creek into a muddy sea. The shift came one humid August morning. The air was dead still, heavy, and silent, the kind of stillness that precedes the end of the world. Then, a voice, not Lila's, but Ma's. She stood by the bench, clutching a damp, folded piece of paper. "Silas," she said, her voice shaking for the first time in years. "This came today. From Lila's mother. She's passed, son. Lila, 2 years ago, caught a fever traveling north. The world tilted. 2 years ago, Silas dropped his thermos. The paper was already crumbling in Ma's shaking hands. She left this for you. Her mother found it in her shoebox." Silas took the damp paper. It was a drawing of the oak tree and the bench, done in charcoal. Underneath, a single looping inscription. "I'll come back when it rains again. But Silas, you must bring the rain yourself." The meaning of the promise exploded in his mind, shattering his reality. She wasn't talking about the sky. She was talking about grief. She was talking about the deluge of emotion he had suppressed, channeled into the external act of waiting. She had died 2 years ago. The waiting was for the internal storm that he refused to let fall. He had been so rigid in his interpretation of when it rains again that he had avoided the true necessary rain. The rain of tears, the washing away of the living hope for the dead truth. The townspeople's skepticism, Homer's quiet confession, the drought, the gentle summer showers, they were all irrelevant. The true conflict was only and always within him. The great, addictive suspense was the battle between his rigid faith and his necessary human sorrow. He sat on the bench, and for the first time in 3 years the sky was utterly silent. No thunder, no wind, no distant rumble. Just the shocking, unbearable quiet of revelation. He had to weep. He had to unleash the storm. He sat there, the crumpled note in his hand, and he finally cried. It was not a gentle shower. It was a tropical storm of sorrow, a physical heaving and shaking that pulled the air from his lungs. The tears fell thick and hot onto the iron of the bench, and then onto the bare, dusty earth beneath. He cried for Lila, for the lost future, for the years he had spent avoiding this very moment. He cried until the front of his shirt was soaked and the salt stung his eyes. He cried until his body was empty and hollowed out. This was the promised rain, the true, terrifying deluge. When it finally subsided, he looked up. The sky was still blue, but something had fundamentally changed. The air was cleaner, thinner, and the massive oak seemed to sigh in relief. He had redeemed the promise not by waiting for an event, but by creating a condition of the soul. The suspense of the waiting was over. Now came the quiet, profound, and final resolution. He stood up, his legs stiff, and looked at the bench. It was wet where his tears had fallen, glistening faintly in the afternoon sun. He folded the drawing and put it into his breast pocket. His vigil, the obsessive, addictive act, was complete. He had waited exactly as he was asked, and in doing so, he had learned what the waiting truly meant. He walked across the square, toward Homer's store, intending to buy a soda, maybe a candy bar, something normal, something trivial. He felt like a man walking on the moon, familiar gravity replaced by a strange lightness. The old town square still stood, the oak still grew, but the emotional landscape of Willow Creek had been irrevocably altered for Silas. He had accessed his subconscious, faced the grief he thought he was preserving, and found that the love for Lila was not in the hope of her return, but in the acceptance of her absence. He walked past Homer, who looked up, his eyes widening slightly. "Silas?" Homer asked, not about the rain but about the change in his posture, the lack of tension in his shoulders. "I'm good, Homer," Silas said, and the word felt real, earned. He bought the soda, walked back to the bench, and sat down. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was just resting. He looked at the vast, clear sky, and for the first time he saw it as beautiful, not as a broken covenant. He stayed there until the sun set, until the shadows grew long and blue beneath the oak. He was not waiting for Lila, but for the next thing, whatever that might be, and he knew he would face it with the strength gained from 3 years of unyielding faith in a metaphor. The story of the boy who waited in the rain was over, and the story of the man who finally let it rain began.